Benjamin Netanyahu, working with Marco Rubio and others, used the negotiations as subterfuge to set Iran up. So the United States was part of Benjamin Netanyahu's surprise attack.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging headfirst into, well, a really bewildering series of events that have shaken not just the Middle East, but sent pretty significant ripples across the entire globe. Just recently, we've all seen these dramatic U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. Then almost immediately, Iran hitting back at a U.S. base in Qatar.
Right, the retaliation.
And then, really startlingly, President Trump declared this ceasefire that just seemed to fall apart almost instantly, leaving, just a trail of confusion and renewed fighting.
It's been a real whirlwind. So many headlines back and forth. And I think for a lot of people, just a profound sense of uncertainty about what's really going on.
Yeah.
And it's precisely that confusion that, rapid escalation followed by what looked like an equally rapid but very fleeting de-escalation.
Well, that makes this deep dive so absolutely critical today.
We're trying to go far beyond just the surface reports, the immediate headlines. We want to uncover the deeper currents, the alleged controversies, the hidden agendas that might be swirling around all this.
Okay.
Our mission really is to pull out those vital nuggets of knowledge that can help you, our listener, understand what might be happening beneath the surface, far from the public eye, in this high-stakes world of geopolitics.
To give a framework, maybe.
Exactly, a framework to analyze these really complex situations.
Absolutely, because when you look closely, and especially when you consider alternative viewpoints, from seasoned analysts, a really dramatic and frankly deeply unsettling question starts to emerge from all this chaos. Was a significant peace deal, maybe a genuine diplomatic path with Iran, actually being sabotaged from the inside?
Sabotaged, yeah.
And if it was, who might have orchestrated what some people are now calling an unnecessary war? Who did it to achieve their own goals, even shockingly, at the risk of a much broader global conflict? I mean, something that could spiral way out of control.
That really is the central investigative question we're digging into today. And to piece together this compelling and honestly deeply concerning narrative, we've been sifting through, various news reports, critical analyses, and perhaps most importantly, the insights from former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter. His perspective, as we'll get into, offers a starkly different, really provocative interpretation of these events. It challenges the conventional wisdom about how and why this all escalated.
Okay, so let's unpack that, because what Scott Ritter is alleging here is, well, it's truly astounding. It completely flips the common narrative, the one most people probably have, on its head.
It really does.
He's claiming that far from being a diplomatic failure that just sort of led to war, the recent military strikes were actually a deliberate act, an act of subterfuge, he calls it, designed specifically to sabotage a diplomatic deal that was nearly done.
Right. So you, like many, might have just assumed, oh, diplomacy broke down. But Ritter argues no, it was never actually meant to succeed. It was, in his view, a strategic deception.
That sounds, almost counterintuitive, doesn't it? How could that work?
It does sound counterintuitive. But our sources, including Ritter's analysis, suggest that before these U.S. and Israeli strikes happened, a surprisingly robust diplomatic path wasn't just being explored, it was actively close to yielding results.
Really? Close?
Yeah, there were ongoing, pretty discreet negotiations between the U.S. and Iran that had apparently progressed significantly. They led to what our sources are describing as genuine draft agreements.
So not just informal chats, then?
No. These weren't just vague talks. They were structured discussions with tangible progress being made.
Okay, so there were concrete goals on the table, things they were actually working towards. That feels like a crucial distinction.
Precisely. The core aim of these confidential talks was incredibly clear, and it directly addressed the main concerns everyone had.
Which were?
The goal was to cap Iran's uranium enrichment at a much lower, sort of non-threatening level, 3.75%, and crucially, to get rid of its stockpile of 60% enriched uranium.
That 60% figure keeps coming up. Why is that specific level so important?
Well, you see, it's significant because, while it's not technically weapons grade, yet that's usually around 90%, being at 60% puts Iran really close. It reduces the time needed to get to weapons grade considerably. So its existence has been a major point of alarm, especially for Israel and the U.S.
Got it. So getting rid of that 60% material would have been a huge step.
A massive step. And Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, was apparently deeply involved in these talks, personally involved. including what was described as a tense 7-hour meeting in Geneva on Friday with the E3.
The E3 being...
Oh, sorry, Britain, France, and Germany. A 7-hour meeting, I mean, that's a marathon, not a quick chat. It signifies really intense, detailed negotiations were happening.
Wow. A 7-hour meeting right before the bombing started. That doesn't sound like preliminary discussions at all. That suggests they were deep in it, possibly, like you said, on the cusp of a real breakthrough.
Absolutely. And the timing here is just critical to Ritter's whole argument. Our sources confirm that planned U.S.-Iran talks set to happen in Oman, seen as a vital next step, maybe where they finalize these draft agreements. Those talks were effectively scuttled, called off abruptly, right after Israel began its initial wave of attacks on June 13th. And Iran, understandably reacted by saying, look, we're not going to negotiate while we're literally under attack.
Makes sense.
So just to recap, you've got this detailed diplomatic track, specific goals, high-level people involved, moving forward right up until military action just violently interrupts it. That's a key piece of the puzzle Ritter presents.
And this is where Scott Ritter's really startling claim of subterfuge comes in. It transforms how we understand that sequence of events.
Exactly.
He doesn't see these negotiations as a genuine peace effort that just got unfortunately disrupted. No, he levels a much more profound accusation. He says these talks were a subterfuge, or, as he puts it, just a front.
That's his central and, most controversial point. Ritter contends the real hidden purpose of this alleged diplomatic front was, quote, to set the Iranians up for this surprise attack.
Set them up? How?
Well, he presents a very specific timeline as the cornerstone of his evidence for this theory. And if it's accurate, it's pretty damning.
Okay, what's the timeline?
According to Ritter, the actual decision by the U.S. to strike Iran was allegedly made way back on March 7th.
March 7th. Got it.
Yet the official U.S. negotiations with Iran only began over a month later, on April 14th.
Wait, hang on. Let me process that. The decision to strike was made, potentially, before the negotiations even started.
Allegedly, yes.
Yeah.
Over a month before.
That completely flips the usual script, doesn't it? The way we normally think these things happen. Usually you hear war is the last resort after diplomacy fails.
Exactly. It turns it completely on its head.
So what does this timeline imply then, if it's true?
Well, it implies that the diplomatic efforts weren't really a genuine attempt at a solution. They were more like a calculated cover.
A cover for what? To buy time?
Maybe. It suggests the negotiations were designed to give the appearance of seeking peace. Perhaps, to lull Iran into a false sense of security, or buy time for military planning, or just provide a kind of diplomatic justification for an outcome military action that was already decided upon.
That really challenges the whole idea of war being a last resort.
It does. It positions diplomacy not as the goal, but as a tactic. A strategic delay or distraction within a path already set towards conflict. It's a nugget of knowledge that, if true, profoundly shifts how we understand the whole process of international conflict.
So it wasn't about if diplomacy could work, but how diplomacy could serve a pre-decided military strike. That's a chilling thought, especially when you think about the human cost.
Right. It takes the idea of bad faith negotiations to a whole different level. It suggests not just insincerity, but a calculated, deliberate deception at the highest levels.
A very different way of understanding how conflicts begin.
Indeed. It forces you to ask, if the decision to strike was already made back in March, what real incentive did the negotiating party have to actually find a peaceful way out in April or May?
Their incentive shifts.
Exactly. It shifts from achieving peace to maybe just managing the optics, managing how it looks. This alleged timeline is really the linchpin of Ritter's argument that this conflict was engineered, not just stumbled into after talks failed.
Okay, so if that's the theory, then the next unavoidable question is, who? Who are the alleged architects of this conflict? Who does Ritter say is pulling the strings?
And he doesn't hold back on this at all. He points fingers very directly at two extremely prominent figures, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister,
Netanyahu,
and a very high-ranking U.S. official, Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Rubio. Right, so what's the specific accusation against Netanyahu?
Ritter makes this incredibly strong, sweeping claim. He says, quote, every major Middle Eastern war in which we've engaged in the past 20 years has been at the instigation of Benjamin Netanyahu.
Wow. Every major war. That's a huge statement.
It is. It connects the whole pattern of conflict directly to Netanyahu, suggesting this isn't a one-off, but a consistent, active role in shaping regional conflicts involving the U.S.
Does he give specifics for this conflict?
Yes. He alleges Netanyahu directly disrupted those ongoing U.S.-Iran negotiations by unilaterally launching Israel's surprise attack on June 13th.
The attack that scuttled the Oman talks.
Exactly. Then, according to Ritter, after starting that fire, Netanyahu actively, quote, talks the United States into a meaningless PR bombing that cost $100 million.
A meaningless PR bombing. He's saying the U.S. strikes serve no real military purpose, just PR.
That's his blunt assessment. He's essentially accusing Netanyahu of initiating the conflict and then manipulating the U.S. into strikes that were more about appearances or of other non-military goals.
And the irony here.
The irony, as Ritter really highlights it, is what's supposedly happening now. After allegedly starting the war and dragging the U.S. in with this meaningless PR bombing, Israel is now, according to Ritter, screaming for American intervention to bring it into this conflict, or rather, to help end it, because they're supposedly in a dire situation and cannot take much more of this.
So start the fire, fan the flames, then ask the U.S. to put it out when it gets too hot.
That's the picture Ritter paints. And it raises this incredibly important and, uncomfortable question for you, the listener, and really for U.S. foreign policy itself. Is U.S. policy being subordinated to the interests of another nation?
That's a fundamental question about sovereignty, about alliances.
It really is. If a close ally can allegedly start a conflict, pull the U.S. in, and then pressure the U.S. to end it on their terms, that fundamentally changes the dynamic of the relationship. It suggests, potentially, an undermining of U.S. autonomy in its own critical foreign policy decisions.
And then Ritter turns his focus to the U.S. side, specifically Secretary of State Marco Rubio. What's the claim there?
The accusation against Rubio is, stunning. Ritter alleges he is, quote, literally a de facto tool of Israel and is carrying the water for Benjamin Netanyahu.
Strong words, de facto tool.
Very strong. Furthermore, Ritter points out that Rubio holds two key positions simultaneously: Secretary of State and National Security Advisor.
Right, the dual hat role.
And Ritter explicitly calls that combination constitutionally problematic. He suggests it's a dangerous concentration of power in one person's hands.
Why problematic? Is it just too much power, or is there a specific constitutional issue?
The concern Ritter implies isn't just about workload. It's about concentrating that much influence over both diplomatic strategy and national security policy in one individual, especially an individual who is, according to these allegations, strongly aligned with external interests.
And it narrows the decision-making channel.
Precisely. It potentially bypasses broader expert opinions, different viewpoints, the usual checks and balances you expect in government. It could lead to a more unilateral, maybe even manipulated foreign policy. And to illustrate this point about alleged alignment, Ritter brings up that really controversial statement made by State Department spokesperson Tammy Bruce. Do you remember that?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
She publicly said, "America is the greatest nation in the world next to Israel."
Yes, I remember that now.
Yeah.
Caused quite a stir, especially coming from the State Department.
Exactly. Ritter views it as more than just a stir. He calls it a profound insult. He goes so far as to say she should be relieved for incompetence because, as he puts it, you don't subordinate the United States to any nation.
So he sees that statement as evidence of this alleged subservience.
He argues it speaks volumes about where U.S. loyalties might lie, suggesting an unprecedented level of alignment, maybe even subservience, to a foreign power. It's a nugget of knowledge pointing to potential ideological currents shaping policy.
And what about Rubio's own stance on diplomacy with Iran, according to Ritter?
Ritter interprets Rubio's public statements and actions as showing an "I don't care about diplomacy" attitude. Like it's just an obstacle.
How so?
He suggests Rubio seems uninterested in what the intelligence community assesses about Iran's actual nuclear intent. He dismisses those assessments, according to Ritter, as basically irrelevant.
Irrelevant. But isn't intent the key thing? Whether they actually plan to build a bomb?
You'd think so. But Ritter argues Rubio's intense focus is solely on the existence of Iran's 60% enriched uranium, which he constantly portrays as an imminent threat.
Okay.
Despite the crucial detail we discussed earlier, that Iran was apparently willing to give up that very material as part of the negotiations that were happening.
Right. So if the intel says no active bomb program, and Iran is willing to negotiate away the worrisome material, then why keep calling it an imminent threat and pushing for military action?
That's the core of Ritter's accusation against Rubio. It leads to a pretty troubling conclusion.
It is.
Ritter suggests this alleged disregard for diplomacy, for intelligence, fuels the idea that Rubio simply wanted to go to war, and that was the outcome he sought.
Implying the facts were secondary to a desired outcome.
Exactly. That opportunities for a peaceful resolution were maybe intentionally ignored or dismissed, not because they weren't viable, but because they didn't fit a predetermined military path. It paints a picture of someone actively seeking conflict. That's a profound nugget of knowledge about how individuals might shape policy.
Okay, so if Netanyahu and Rubio are the alleged architects, who's providing the backing, the influence? Ritter goes even further, doesn't he, pointing to donors.
He does. He points directly to what he calls the powerful Israeli donor class.
So the donor class, what's the claim there?
He makes the extremely strong claim that this group has established an ironclad grip on the Congress, implying widespread control over lawmakers. And now, he says, apparently has an ironclad grip on the White House, too.
That's a huge claim. What evidence does he offer?
He points to specific examples. He cites reports that former President Trump allegedly took $100 million from Miriam Adelson, who is a very prominent pro-Israel donor. And he highlights Marco Rubio getting the Secretary of State job, even though he wasn't picked for VP, implying it might have been related to donor influence or preferences, rather than just standard political calculation.
Suggesting a direct link between big money and key foreign policy appointments.
That's the implication.
Yeah.
A potentially transactional relationship that could undermine democratic processes and put specific interests ahead of broader national interests.
Right.
And Ritter contrasts this sharply with the past. He points out that it wasn't long ago that being seen as too close to Israel could actually stop someone from getting a high-level security clearance. The worry was compromised judgment.
And now,
he argues with real concern, it seems like it's almost a prerequisite for selection to high office.
wow, that's a radical shift of true.
It raises a critical and deeply unsettling question about the integrity of U.S. policy. How much does foreign financial influence shape decisions? Could it lead to what Ritter calls unnecessary wars, even risking global stability and core U.S. interests? It suggests a major change in how foreign policy operates. This nugget of knowledge really speaks to the structure of influence.
Okay, the accusations are stark. Diplomacy as deception, key figures pushing for war, powerful donors influencing policy. Which brings us back to the actual U.S. and Israeli strikes. If Ritter's claims hold any water, were these strikes militarily necessary, or were they, as he suggests, something else entirely, like that PR bombing?
That's the critical next step in his analysis, and it's a pretty cynical view. Let's quickly recap the public timeline of the offensive. June 13th, Israel starts bombing Iran. Claims objectives met by June 23rd.
Okay.
Then June 21st, the U.S. launches its own airstrikes. Targets 3 key Iranian nuclear sites, Fordo, Isfahan, Natanz.
And these weren't minor strikes. We heard reports of sophisticated bunker buster bombs, Tomahawk missiles, weapons designed for serious damage. And President Trump publicly said the facilities were completely and fully obliterated. Very decisive language.
That was absolutely the public claim, painted in the strongest possible terms. But Ritter, using his background as a weapons inspector, offers a completely different assessment, just incredibly blunt.
What does he say?
He states definitively, no ifs, ands, or buts, that the U.S. bombing served no legitimate military purpose.
Wow, no legitimate military purpose. That contradicts everything. The whole justification was neutralizing an imminent threat from Iran's nuclear program. How can he say that?
Precisely. His key evidence is profound. He states unequivocally that the 60% enriched uranium and the advanced centrifuge cascades the very things that were supposed to be the imminent threat. The main targets were not destroyed.
Not destroyed. After bunker busters and tomahawks?
Apparently not. And even worse, according to Ritter, their current location is now unknown.
Unknown. So, wait. If the key material and machines weren't destroyed, and we don't even know where they are now, isn't that actually worse than before the strikes?
According to Ritter, yes. Objectively, worse off today than we were before the military action. Because the crucial monitoring by the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, is now completely severed.
Ah, the inspectors.
Right. Before the strikes, at least the IAEA had eyes on it. They knew where the 60% material was. They could monitor it. Now, with that monitoring gone and the material's location unknown, there's this huge black hole of information, a much deeper level of opacity, which is a dangerous step backward for non-proliferation.
So the reality, if Ritter's right, is the exact opposite of Trump's completely obliterated rhetoric.
A stark contrast. It's a crucial nugget of knowledge separating the political spin from the alleged operational reality.
Okay, so if these expensive high-tech strikes were militarily useless, according to Ritter, what was their real purpose? Going back to the subterfuge theory, was it just provocation or just wrecking the diplomacy?
It ties right back into that subterfuge claim. If the main goal wasn't actually taking out the nuclear material, then the purpose shifts entirely. It becomes political, not military.
Right.
Ritter suggests it was a deliberate move to achieve a specific political end. Maybe trigger a limited response from Iran that could then be used to justify more action later. Or maybe just create a new reality, a military clash, that makes the old diplomatic path impossible to return to.
And breaking the IAEA access helps that too.
Cleverly, yes. It creates more uncertainty about Iran's program, which can then be used as justification for more suspicion, more pressure, maybe more action down the line. It's a highly cynical view of using military force not to achieve military goals, but as a geopolitical chess move to reshape the diplomatic board.
And Iran did respond. We saw the missiles hit Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar.
Yeah.
How did that unfold, and what does Ritter make of it? Does it fit this alleged grand bargain idea?
Right. Iran launched missiles at Al Udeid on June 23rd, explicitly retaliating for the U.S. strikes. Now, the exact number of missiles is a bit fuzzy. Ritter says 6, Trump said 14, Qatar reported 19.
Okay, but the outcome?
The crucial detail is they were largely intercepted. Qatari and U.S. Patriot batteries did their job. Damage was minimal.
And importantly, no casualties reported, right. And then Trump thanked Iran for early notice. That was bizarre.
It was extraordinary. And Ritter's take fits perfectly with that oddness. He calls Iran's response a very limited scope retaliation.
Symbolic.
He even suggests it might have been set up to fail, maybe using older, less reliable missiles.
Set up to fail.
Potentially. A fact that Trump publicly acknowledged getting advance warning, suggesting Iran tipped them off, plus no casualties. It all feeds into Ritter's interpretation. Both sides used extreme rhetoric, but delivered very minor strikes. No real blood spilled. It wasn't about causing maximum damage.
So this whole exchange, missiles flying, bases targeted, it might have been more like theater. A controlled escalation.
That's exactly what Ritter suggests. This tit-for-tat could be part of a carefully managed stabilization effort, or even, as he puts it, the makings of a grand bargain.
A grand bargain?
He points to something significant. Iran's foreign minister reportedly met with Putin before Iran launched its missiles. Ritter thinks this implies Russia basically greenlit the limited strike.
Coordinated de-escalation.
If true, yes. It suggests these weren't uncontrolled hostile acts, but maybe part of a calculated dance, a negotiation happening through limited, symbolic military actions. That's a profound nugget of knowledge. It changes our whole understanding these weren't acts of war, but signals in a high-stakes game.
But then, almost right after this seemingly choreographed exchange, Trump announces a complete and total ceasefire, calls it the 12-day war, and it immediately collapses. How does that fit the grand bargain idea?
It doesn't fit neatly, does it? And the rapid breakdown just highlights how incredibly fragile any peace effort is here, especially one potentially built on deception.
What happened?
Israel immediately accused Iran of firing missiles into Beersheba, killing several people, hitting homes. That prompted renewed Israeli strikes.
And Iran's response?
Foreign Minister Araghchi said Iran would halt attacks if Israel stopped its airstrikes by a specific time, showing willingness, but only if reciprocated. This back and forth just shows the deep, deep mistrust.
So on one side, Ritter suggests a calculated, maybe even coordinated, limited response from Iran. On the other, the ceasefire instantly fails amid new attacks and deaths. How do we square that?
That's the core tension. The breakdown shows how hard it is to stop a conflict allegedly started through subterfuge. Even if there's some underlying attempt at a managed de-escalation or a bargain, the visible fighting, the accusations, they continue. It makes trust impossible. It's a dangerous game, whether calculated or not, where perception and reality are constantly clashing. That's a key nugget of knowledge about these high-stakes conflicts.
Okay, so this whole alleged scenario, subterfuge, orchestrated conflict, it obviously has huge global ramifications. What does Ritter say about where Israel stands now and what it means for the U.S.?
Well, Ritter claims that Israel, despite maybe initiating this, now finds itself in a very difficult, even dire situation.
Dire? How so?
He asserts they can't sustain the conflict for much longer, maybe not even another week. And ironically, they are now apparently pressuring the United States to bring an end to this conflict by the end of the week.
Wow. That is ironic. If Ritter's right, they allegedly dragged the U.S. in, and now they need the U.S. to get them out because they're struggling.
Profound irony. And it forces us to think hard about these wars of choice. Conflict started not out of immediate defense, but by strategic decision. If Israel chose this path, allegedly direct diplomacy, and then got bogged down, it raises huge questions about their strategic planning and about how U.S. policy can get tied to another nation's potential miscalculations, a critical nugget of knowledge about engineered conflicts going wrong.
What about the rest of the world? Are other countries trying to calm things down?
Oh, absolutely. The international community is definitely worried, especially European nations, the E3, Britain, France, Germany. They're pushing hard for de-escalation, for getting back to diplomacy.
Why are they so concerned?
They fear a wider war, obviously, but also massive economic instability, particularly around the Strait of Hormuz. If that shipping lane gets shut down, global oil supplies are hit hard. The EU's foreign policy chief called that scenario extremely dangerous and not good for anybody. The economic fallout would be huge.
So fear of economic chaos is driving diplomacy. Is there action at the UN?
Yes, significantly. Russia, China, and Pakistan are sponsoring a UN Security Council resolution. It calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and specifically condemns attacks on nuclear sites, a clear nod to the U.S. strikes.
Will it pass? What about the U.S.?
Here's where it gets interesting. Ritter suggests there's a surprising possibility the U.S. might actually vote in favor of such a resolution.
Really? After launching the strikes, that would be a major turnaround.
A profound shift, yeah. Maybe a belated move back towards diplomacy after the military option proved messy or counterproductive, which leads to this paradox. Could this conflict, allegedly born from deception to avoid peace, actually end up forcing a diplomatic solution? A ceasefire or grand bargain, but at what cost?
And what about the ultimate risk? Ritter's warning about World War III. He claims Trump risked initiating World War III. That's terrifying.
He does lay it out that starkly. And he pushes us to think about what could have happened. What if Iran hadn't responded with just a few largely intercepted missiles? What if they'd launched a massive retaliation, hit U.S. bases hard, caused hundreds, thousands of casualties? What if they attacked oil infrastructure, causing a global crisis?
The stakes were incredibly high.
Immense, terrifying stakes. And Ritter argues Trump was willing to gamble with them through what he calls this precipitous, irresponsible action, an action allegedly driven by politics, not military need.
And even if they managed to cobble together some kind of ceasefire or grand bargain now, what's the lasting damage?
Ritter argues that even if stability emerges, maybe brokered by Russia and China, it comes with a heavy, unnecessary price tag. Lives lost, infrastructure wrecked, regional stability shattered. A price, he insists, that genuine diplomacy could have avoided entirely.
So the military action itself was a failure, regardless of what comes next.
In his view, if it was truly subterfuge, yes. It's a fundamental failure. The nugget of knowledge is this idea of a Pyrrhic peace winning something. But at such a devastating cost, it wasn't worth it.
It's a stark reminder, even if you get a result you want, the way you get there matters. Deception leaves deep scars.
Absolutely, both literally and geopolitically. It destroys trust, sets dangerous precedents. If diplomacy itself can be weaponized like this, used as a tool for starting conflict, it undermines the whole system of international relations. It makes every future negotiation suspect.
So we've really dug into Scott Ritter's central and, yes, incredibly controversial claim that these strikes weren't about failed diplomacy, but deliberate subterfuge to kill a peace deal. The narrative he paints involves powerful figures, Netanyahu, possibly Rubio, allegedly manufacturing an unnecessary war, maybe serving external interests, subordinating U.S. policy, and risking global conflict.
It's a truly complex and, unsettling picture. And it really underscores that international relations are rarely simple, rarely what they seem just from the headlines. Understanding the alleged motives, this intricate dance between public diplomacy and potential covert action, it's crucial for grasping what might really be happening. It challenges us all to look deeper.
Absolutely. Because if diplomacy can be used as a front for conflict, if negotiation itself can be weaponized, and if wars are started by choice for political gain, not necessity, well, it raises a really profound question for all of us, as citizens trying to stay informed. How do we actually figure out the truth? How do we hold power accountable in a world just flooded with information, competing stories, and sometimes, it seems, intentional blurring of lines between fact and, fabrication? It's a huge challenge to our own critical thinking, something to definitely ponder as you navigate the world around us.